Hello and welcome to our podcast that we are calling an election primer. We're going to go ahead and talk through the typical steps of a federal level executive branch election. So in essence, the election for the presidency. Let's go ahead and see what we're talking about. So like we said, our focus for this presentation will be the federal level executive branch. So in essence, we are looking at how someone becomes the president of the United States. And so you can see our governmental tic-tac-toe in the bottom right. We use this chart all the time if you have not seen it yet for some reason. But we are looking at the election for the presidency of the United States. We know that similar patterns exist in state and local level elections, and there are also similar patterns in other branch elections. And typically that is just the legislative branch. Since the judicial branch, those people are not normally running for election. They are normally appointed. So all of the things we're going to say are geared towards the presidential election at the federal level, but there are overlaps with state and local and with legislative branch elections. So to build some background, the United States is said to operate in a two-party system, which is interesting because the Constitution doesn't say anything about political parties. George Washington, our first president, didn't belong to one, and he thought they were not a great idea, and then warned the nation against them. But with time, pretty quickly after the nation was formed and after George Washington's administration, we do start to see the emergence of political parties. That makes sense. People who think similarly about ideas are going to want to hang out together. And eventually you get enough of those people together, they form a group, start to apply political pressure to the system, and then we have political parties. So while much of this will be focused on the Democrats and the Republicans as our two major political parties in the nation, please understand that there are many other political parties out there. It's not like you have to pick a party at all. You can be a registered independent, or if you choose, you could eventually join one of the two major political parties, or if you choose, you could join one of the other many political parties that are out there. And here you can see the actual presidential election ballot from 2016. And you can see in the upper left, there we have the two major political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. But you can see there are at least 12 other political parties all offering somebody as a candidate for that same office. American Constitution, Libertarian, Green, the Independent People, the Nonviolent Resistance or Pacifist Party. So again, you don't have to join any party. You don't even have to join the two big ones. There are many parties out there that have nuanced beliefs on many different issues. So if you ever felt compelled like you do want to get into the system in terms of being a member of something, there are many, many options out there. And as you are trying to figure out, well, maybe I want to be part of a group, maybe I want to find people who share similar ideas to me, you're going to want to look at the party ideologies. Like, what do these parties stand for? What do they believe? That is their ideology. And so overlap the political party named with what you know about the political spectrum from previous podcasts. This spectrum is a continuum. So moving toward the left of the spectrum, you're going to get parties with more liberal views on certain issues. If you move to the right, you're going to get parties with more conservative views on certain issues. So as we move forward with this presentation, consider this clarification. It might add more clarity to think about the two parties that we're going to be talking about in terms of ideology, which is a fancy word for what people believe. And so the idea of a liberal party, which is to the left of the political spectrum end, or a more conservative party. Those ideologies have existed throughout American history, throughout political history of the world. The thing that hangs up people is that the parties that have those ideologies have changed names throughout that history. So yes, the Democratic Party, the name was from the concept of democracy, demo meaning people, so rule by the people. It did evolve from the Democratic Republican Party that Thomas Jefferson started back in the day, so early 1800s. But the first president to be elected under the Democratic Party name was Andrew Jackson, who served from 1829 to 1837. And like we mentioned, the Republican Party was formed in the early 1850s. Its first president under the Republican banner was Abraham Lincoln in 1860. And they took their name from the idea of a political republic, which is rule through representatives. Oftentimes, the Republican Party uses its abbreviation of the GOP. We don't say GOP, we say the GOP for the Grand Old Party. And so like we mentioned before, and this is where political ideology is important to keep in mind as a layer contrasting with the party names. At the time, the Democrats were more politically and socially conservative. They favored slavery before the Civil War. They wanted to end help to freed slaves after the Civil War. There was a large presence in the KKK in the Civil War of Democrats. And at first, the Republicans were more politically and socially liberal. They wanted to abolish slavery, which was new for the time. It was a change. That was the liberal idea at the time. And there was a group called the Radical Republicans who wanted to push for racial integration, voting rights, and equality for those recently freed slaves, now called African Americans, right after that Civil War. So in the 1800s, the Democrats were more conservative, the Republicans were more liberal. But as we mentioned, there were changes. In about 1948, the Democratic Party began to splinter over the civil rights issues. So that was considered a plank, one issue in their party's platform. And so conservative Democrats did not want the civil rights changes to that party platform. And those conservative Democrats tended to be situated in the South. Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, the Carolinas, etc. And so these conservative Democrats looked at the civil rights change and said, you know what, we're not digging that. And so those conservative Democrats, again, mostly geographically from the South, they split from the Democratic Party. They said if the Democratic Party is going to do the more liberal thing starting in around 1948 and offer a plank on civil rights, they were not down with that. So they split off and they formed these smaller parties like the Dixiecrats, the States' Rights, the American Independent parties. So many of the members of these new parties were former Democrats who said, you know what, the Democratic Party is moving too far to the left. They left the party and formed their own parties. Now here's the challenge. Those smaller parties were not going to have electoral success at the presidential level because the Republicans and the Democrats were still the two largest parties out there. So eventually, these members from the South who were more conservative in their thinking took their membership in the Dixiecrats, the States' Rights, the American Independent parties, and they had to meld with some other big political party that might push those ideas more forward, might get somebody elected at the national level. While those groups had broken from the Democratic Party, they certainly weren't going to go back, so the only other major party that was around was the Republicans. And so as you get these more conservative folk who left the Democrats, went to these transitional parties, they eventually went to the Republican Party and then moved the Republican Party more to the right on the spectrum. So as a result, around 1948 through the 60s, we see the Democratic Party moving more left on the political spectrum, which is the political party that is seen as more liberal today. And the Republican Party was joined by these conservative folk, and that moved the Republican Party more right on the political spectrum. And that's the party we see today, where the Republicans are more conservative and the Democrats are more liberal today. And you can see this in presidential electoral politics. You can see in 1948, the blue represents the Democratic Party. They won a bunch of the states. You can see where the Republicans won their states in red. But then you see this yellow color. Those were states won by those third parties, by the Dixiecrats, by the American Independent parties, the States' Rights parties. And so in 1948, yes, the South voted for these third-party candidates, the more conservative, the parties that had formed by conservative folks leaving the Democrats. And then you can see in 1964, when almost the entire nation voted for Democrat Lyndon Johnson, you can see that the South had pretty much joined the Republican Party, and they vote as a block, as a group, and we call it the Solid South. That Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, etc., they tend to all vote the same way, because socially, politically, economically, culturally, those states share a lot of features in a very similar fashion. A majority of the people in that area tend to think and vote conservatively, and so that Solid South voting bloc was formed. So let's really get to the meat of this. How does one become president of the United States? There are many, many steps. And it seems like every 4 years that cycle is starting earlier and earlier. It doesn't just happen in the election year, like January of 2020, when the election happens in November of that year. We start to see things happening years before the election year, because it seems like we're in this constant cycle of campaigning. We're going to list the typical steps for an election, but sometimes these steps happen a little bit out of order. So if you're saying, oh, this debate happened before this primary, but you said it was the other way around, don't get too hung up on some of the intermediate steps. Additionally, the other thing to think about is that running for president is exceptionally expensive. Having to travel around the nation, to rent speaking areas, to hire a staff, to put ads on the internet, in the newspapers, on the TV and the radio. All of this process is very, very expensive. So while we say to kids, anybody can be president, anybody can rise to that office, the question we would pose is this: is that true? Can any American truly rise to the level of president, not just in terms of whether you were born here or not, but just in terms of the sheer volume of money it would take to run a campaign? Because if you look at the presidents of the modern era, many of them, if not most of them, have been independently wealthy before they even ran for president. These are not small town hardware store owners who say, I want to run for president and then actually win. The people who have won in the modern era have been independently wealthy before they even started. So the question is, can everyone rise to this office, or are we seeing perhaps an oligarchy, rule by a few rich people? So the first step to becoming president or to winning any election is that someone has to throw their hat in the ring. It's a boxing metaphor that Teddy Roosevelt used back in the 1900s. Basically, you have to say, I am officially running for this office. And so the challenger would literally throw their hat in the ring and say, I'm next. And that's what a politician has to do. That person has to announce their intent to run. The next step is the primary debate series. And here's where we start to talk in this podcast about Republicans and Democrats. So while we know there are many parties out there, we're going to focus on the big two. So in a typical election cycle, if there are many people from any one party who want to become the one to represent their party in the presidential election, that party has to have a primary. They have to take all of the Democrats who want to run as the Democratic candidates. They have to have debates amongst the Democratic Party to narrow down that field. So perhaps you could have 2 people running. You might have 10 Democrats running, and those people debate and say, here's how I would best represent the party. No, here's how I would. And the same thing is happening on the Republican side. Depending on the year, there could be many people running for that presidential nomination to be the one Republican who runs at the end of this whole thing. Each party has these debates where they narrow down the field of all the Democrats or all the Republicans, narrow them down to one person for each party. So at the end of this, one Democrat is emerging, one Republican is emerging, and then yes, one Libertarian, one Green Party, one Communist Party. There's one for each party. And these tend to happen in the spring and summer of that election year. So kind of mixed in with the debates, we have primary elections. And here's where ordinary American citizens cast their vote for which person they want to represent their party. So Democrats vote for the Democrat they want to see as the one who emerges from these crowded primaries. The Republicans vote for the Republican candidate they want to see to emerge from the 6 or 7 candidates that might be duking it out. And so most states in the union are now just doing primary elections, where people go in, they vote, they walk out, they're done. There are some states that use a process called a caucus. These are basically neighborhood meetings where people literally get together in like a schoolhouse, in a school gymnasium, in a church, in a community center, and all the people in that neighborhood get together, hash it out. They make impassioned speeches as to who they want their candidate to be, and then at the end of it, they try to come up with one winner from that precinct. So like the city of Broomfield, there's like 5 polling areas there, and people would get together, and at the end of the night, they would say, everybody who met at the Legacy High School gym, they think the best Republican candidate to move forward is fill in the blank, or the best Democrat to move forward would be fill in the blank. So these take a lot more time, ask for a lot more commitment from people, as opposed to a primary election where people just fill out a ballot, they've decided who they want to move forward, and they move on. And these tend to happen again in the spring and summer of that election year. Now, in the late summer of the election year, so a couple months before the actual presidential election, each party is going to have a national convention. And this is a meeting of the party delegates to formally nominate a candidate for president for their party. So after all of the primary elections or the primary caucuses have gone, parties can kind of figure out that it seems like, hey, the will of the Democrats is to have this person be our candidate. Or the Republicans would say, it seems like based on all of these primaries and caucuses, the will of the American Republicans is to have so-and-so represent the party. The National Convention is just where it becomes official, where such and such will be the Democratic nominee, and they will face off against this Republican nominee. Again, plus all of the other smaller parties that are out there. And right around that time of the National Convention, this is when presidential candidates create their presidential ticket. And what that means is that this is where the presidential nominee chooses a running mate, someone who will run with them as their potential vice president. And so that combination of a president and vice presidential candidate is called the ticket. So this happens right around the time of the National Convention, so late summer of the election year. So a long time ago in early American elections, whoever got the most votes became president. Whoever came in second was the vice president. So it did happen in the early American presidential elections that the president and the vice president, who had to work together, did not agree philosophically on many issues. That was changed. And then moving forward from Jefferson's time, it became a ticket thing. So if you want to vote for Johnny, you vote for Johnny and his vice presidential nominee as well. Or if you want to vote for Sally, you vote for Sally and that person's nominee as well. So you're voting in essence for 2 people when you truly vote for that one ticket. And so the question comes up, how would a presidential nominee pick the person they want to be their vice president? There's all kinds of different strategies out there that candidates use to create a strong ticket, to give them the best chance to win that election. For example, John F. Kennedy running in the 1960 election, he knew he was going to struggle in winning the states from the South. He was from Massachusetts, he was a senator, he was relatively young, and he knew that the people in the South didn't know him, didn't like his politics, didn't like his family. So he chose a Texan senator in Lyndon Johnson. And so people in the South looked at that ticket of Kennedy and Johnson and then said, hey, if he's going to go ahead and pick a Southerner, a Texan, maybe I'll give my vote to that ticket. And in 1960, that combination did well. So at that national convention, they've announced their running mate, they've created the ticket, and parties are writing their party platforms. So again, late summer of the election year. And so all parties are going to write those platforms, which is a written document that gives their stand on the issue. Each position is called a plank. You're going to see in these party platforms, what do the Democrats think about climate change? How would they address that? How would the Democrats address abortion, public schools, taxes, welfare, whatever? The Republicans would write a document offering their perspective on the same issues. And so as an informed voter, the best place to figure out exactly what the parties and therefore the candidates stand for is to go to these party platforms. Bypass the outlandish claims on the radio, the internet, TV ads, things like that. Go to the party platforms, see if those parties believe similar things to what you believe, and then figure out where you would want to give your vote. So late summer through fall of the election year, that's when we are in the general election campaign. This is when we've essentially taken all the Democrats and narrowed it down to one, taken all the Republicans, narrowed it down to one. And again, those two major political party candidates start going at it head to head. And yes, other political parties' candidates are campaigning, but this is where that money comes into play. That Libertarian Party candidate is campaigning right now, but do they have enough money to buy enough ad space to be competitive with the Democrats and the Republicans? Regardless, this is when we see the leaders of those two major parties going head to head. It's kind of the final two in the presidential election campaign season. And so the question becomes, if you were the Democratic or Republican presidential nominee, where would you go? Where would you spend your money to travel to? Where would you spend money to offer ads or hold rallies or encourage people to vote? This is the Electoral College map. The data is from 2016, so you can see which states have the most electoral power. And again, if you want more information about exactly how the Electoral College works, we have a podcast on that. But in short, you're going to go to the states that have a lot of people in them. And if they have a lot of people in them, they have a lot of electoral power. So you can see any of the states with stars have reasonably high numbers of electoral votes. And that is typically where you see presidential candidates go to. Hold rallies, spend money for ads on TV there. They're going to try to win California, Texas, Florida, New York. Those are massive states in terms of population and power in the Electoral College. And that is typically where we see candidates go. We don't see them go to smaller, less powerful states like, say, Montana or Wyoming. Not that those aren't great states, not that those aren't great people, but electorally, those states don't carry the same power as the states that have a high population, therefore a high electoral vote count. So during that late summer and fall of the election year, while candidates are out crossing the nation, seeking votes, holding rallies, there are probably going to be general election debates. And this is where you're going to see that Republican candidate and that Democratic candidate one-on-one on a debate stage. And so while we have said going to the party platforms would give you a very accurate accounting of what each party believes, most people don't do that. We watch the TV, we watch the internet. We want to see these people talk to each other and share their views on the issues live, face to face. And so they're going to be televised in some way debates. That first televised debate was in 1960 between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. It was the first time a debate was held on TV. Previously, they'd only been on radio. And people look at that 1960 debate as a historical moment because people who watched the debates on TV said that Kennedy did a better job. They said he just looked more comfortable. He looked presidential. And people who watched it on TV said, yeah, I'd probably vote for Kennedy. At the same time, people who listened to the debates on radio thought that Nixon had better answers, that he sounded more presidential over the radio. And in the end, more people had given their vote to Kennedy. So perhaps those televised debates made a massive change in how presidents present themselves during that general election cycle. where TV, internet ads, debates face-to-face really are important. So then we get to the general election. This is the fall of the election year. It is the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November of the election year. So for example, if November 1st fell on a Tuesday, that is not when the election would be. It would be the next Tuesday because it follows the first Monday. And so in that general election, we're looking at two different votes, although one truly elects the president. We look at the popular vote. That is the vote count of the people in each state. That is where every single person's vote is simply counted. And we can see throughout the entire nation how many Americans voted for the Democratic candidate, how many voted for the Republican candidate. But that doesn't determine the winner of the presidency. What truly matters is, again, that electoral college vote. And so the number of electoral votes for each state is determined by the number of representatives in the House that each state has, plus 2 for the number of senators that each state has. So in essence, states with larger populations have more electoral votes. It's called a winner-take-all system. If 50% plus one person in the state vote for the Democratic candidate, that candidate gets all the electoral votes of that state. And vice versa. If 50% plus one person votes for the Republican candidate in that state, that candidate gets all the electoral votes from that state. And so the popular vote does matter on a state-by-state basis, but truly we are looking at the electoral votes and the electoral college vote to determine who wins the overall presidency. And once the popular votes are counted, electoral college votes are accorded to the candidates. Whoever gets 270 or more electoral votes is declared the winner of the American presidency. So the last step that we would look at in this presentation is inauguration. So this happens the January following the election year. So if there's an election in November of 2020, whoever wins does not officially take office until January 20th of 2021. So there is some lag time. They call it the lame duck session. So in the event that somebody who is currently the president is voted out, that person is still technically the president until January 20th, which happens a couple months later. So even though the people have not given them the chance for a second term, they are still the president, they are still in office for a couple of months. And the flip side, if that were to happen, the new person who did win the election does not officially take power until Inauguration Day. And that inauguration ceremony is where the president takes the oath of office, which you can see there directly from the Constitution. So once the president has taken that oath of office, their term begins. And so according to the Constitution, that term lasts 4 years. Now, there are a couple ways that term could end early. The president could die in office, and that has happened to 8 presidents. It could end if they quit, and that has happened by 1 president. And their term could end if they are impeached and convicted, which we'll talk about in a separate presentation as to what that actually is. We have had 3 presidents who have been impeached, which basically means to be accused of a crime, but we have not had any who were convicted of those charges, so we have not had any who were removed from office. Unless they die, quit, or are removed through the impeachment process, the presidential term lasts 4 years. So that is it, a long explanation of political parties and how they change and political ideologies and how the race for the office of president works. Please make sure you understand all the nooks and crannies of all of this information, but if you have questions, please bring those into class so we can get those answered for you. Otherwise, thanks so much, and we will see you soon.